Yeah. If that's it there, yeah. Don't want to shout too much. What about back pocket? Yeah?
Yes.
That okay, yeah? That okay, yeah? Okay.
Okay, we can say good afternoon. Huh? Sounds weird in Spanish, say good afternoon. But good afternoon, and welcome to the Faculty of Economics of the University of Castilla-La Mancha. My name is Francisco Sáez. I'm Vice Rector for Economics and Planning. And here with me in the table we have, well, you already know him, but Víctor Montuenga is the president of the Spanish Association of Labor Economics. And on the left, María Ángeles Davia, which is the coordinator of the local organizing committee, and she's also a colleague at the Faculty of Economics. And on my left hand, we have Francisco Escribano, which is the dean of the Faculty of Economics. Now, Víctor, will give us a short speech, I guess.
Hello. Thank you, Mr. Vice-Rector, Mr. Decano. Thank you, all of you, for being here. It's a pleasure for me to join again in person, in one-to-one, in group, to be all together here now in Albacete. We all know that virtual congresses have some advantages, but I think they lack two important features. The first one is the possibility of networking by groups, by people, one-to-one, and the second one is the social contact. So I especially acknowledge to María Ángeles and the Faculty of Economics and Business and the University of Castilla-La Mancha for giving us the possibility to be here, to be all together, and to share this time for sharing our research and to spend some time enjoying this meeting. Yesterday, you all know the Congress started with the econometric course given by Raúl Ramos and Antonio Di Paolo on econometric tools. I especially acknowledge them to give the course because we know the restricted time they have for their academic positions. Now we have the first meeting with Seamus McGuinness. Tomorrow we have the second meeting, the second keynote conference by Brendan Burchell. And this afternoon we have the round table on a special topic on Spanish economy. Tomorrow in the afternoon we'll have the assembly. All of you, just because you are in this Congress, I'll welcome to the meeting tomorrow in the afternoon. And in the evening, we'll have the gala dinner, where we can share our time. And the grants, the Luis Toaria grants and the Lluís Fina Award. The finality of these grants and this award is to keep in mind the influence of these special researchers in our meeting and in our association. And in the second place is to give the opportunity and to enforce people to keep doing research for both the young people and the more senior people. And just to give the thanks to the faculty, to the university, and especially to Maria Angeles, because it's just 1 year after the last meeting, and she was completely convinced that it will be a success to be here, and I think that this is a real fact, because we are now all are here, and we are going to spend some time all together. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. And now, Maria Angeles, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so welcome everybody. 3 years ago, we presented our candidacy to, to host the next Labor Economics Conference. We couldn't imagine what was going to happen afterwards. So we have one pandemic, which is now in the 8th invisible wave. Probably you know about it. We have gone through a lockdown, one pandemic, one heat wave, we skipped that one volcano, it wasn't here, fortunately. Then Renfe didn't sell the tickets until 2 weeks before the conference. And now we have the NATO summit, which is going to affect us as well. And you will see it this afternoon. It is actually affecting us in the program. I will tell you about it later. So after all, if we are here, it's by miracle. Definitely. So, let's face it, let's enjoy this miracle. That's my main message for today. Let's enjoy this miracle. Let's enjoy the fact that we're together, learning from each other, and with the typical and traditional way of doing things in the Spanish Association of Labor Economics. This year, the academic committee and the organizing committee have been working together. So Nuria has been the leader of the academic committee, and she has provided me some basic figures about who we are and how many papers we have. So we received about 101 papers. We accepted 94, of which 74 papers are going to be presented, and we have nearly 90 people registered. And we come from very different locations. So not only from different universities in Spain, but from 16 different universities abroad. From Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, and also from Paris School of Economics, Sapienza in Roma. Let me see my notes. Grenoble, Paris Nanterre University, Trinity College, Dublin, Beira Interior, so Leuven. So we are a very, very diverse group of people, and you know that diversity is wealth, and it is really, really good, so I'm very sure that will increase the quality of the experience. And now as the chair of the organizing committee, I need to thank all those who have made this occasion true. So I remember when we set this idea that we are going to organize this, I said, look, I don't have any money, but I have a team, and I have a team. So we are 9 people working together in this school. You will notice they are the ones with the yellow badges, and they are over here. They're Carmen, Ángela, Lourdes, Bea, David, Nuria, Alejandra in a different location. And do I miss anybody? Carlos, who is receiving another guest. So I ask you for a large thank you for him, for them. The good news is that I not only have a team, I have money after 3 years. So let's talk about the money. We have received funding and help and support, material support, sometimes financial support from different academic institutions. From the university, we have help from the Vicerrectorado de Investigación, from our department, the Department of Spanish Economics and International Economics and Econometrics. We have support from the school as well. And outside the university, we have support from the Ministry of Labor, the municipality, the Diputación. So, you know, little by little, that everything helps, no? Everything helps. And I hope you will find a good conference after all these situations. Let's call it a miracle instead of a conference. Thank you for being here. Thanks very, very much for all of you who had to look into Google Maps to see, first of all, that Albacete existed. Secondly, how to reach here. So those two challenges have been over. So thank you very much for coming here, all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, María Ángeles. And now, Francisco Paco Escribano, our dean, will give us a few words.
Thank you. Good afternoon, dear Paco, estimate Victor, and dear María Ángeles. Thank you very much. Welcome to Albacete at the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration. Thank you very much for choosing Albacete for organize 15th Laboral Economics meeting. It's a place, it's an honor for this faculty organize this meeting. Congratulations, María Ángeles, and the rest of the organization committee for your work, for this emotive work for all the people, for this work in silence, for the support of every activity that we organize at this faculty. Thank you very much. I hope you can enjoy the papers, the research of the rest of the participants. I see the program, and you have to date for discuss and know the best research in laboral economics. Congratulations for the level of your research. Thank you very much, and enjoy the meeting, and of course, enjoy Albacete City.
Thank you, Paco. And just finally, let me again give you a warm welcome to the university. Warm, in all the sense of the word warm. Welcome to the University of Castilla-La Mancha, especially those of you that come from abroad. I'm sure you'll have three good days, let's say that. 3 good days. First of all, I'd like to thank first the Spanish Association of Labor Economics for choosing the University of Castilla-La Mancha to host this meeting, this event for the University of Castilla-La Mancha. It's an honor and a pleasure to host this event, so thank you for choosing it. I'd like to acknowledge, although María Ángeles has already named them, sorry, I have to acknowledge the local organizing committee, my colleagues, María Ángeles, and also Carmen, Ángela, Lourdes, Beatriz, David, Nuria, and Carlos, which is not here. I'd like to thank them for organizing this event, for being a bit risky, taking that decision, and for the effort of organizing it. And also I'd like to acknowledge the scientific committee for choosing the election of the topics, and also for the election of the keynote speakers. I'll have a chance to look at the program. We have a keynote on minimum wage employment by Seamus McGuinness. By the way, what a surname for an Irish. It's a really hot topic. I mean. Wage employment, minimum wage employment. We have also a round table, which I wish I could be there, because we have a round table regarding the labor reform, the Spanish labor reform, which is affecting a lot to the universities, the way we incorporate our researches and the way we do our work. These days we have the labor reform, we have the the new law of science, we have the new law of universities, and all this new regulation is shaking the universities, and me as part of the team of the rectorship, I'm a bit shaken these days. No? But so I'm sure this roundtable is going to be really interesting. For me, I mean, our university, we have 72% of our budget is on labor cost. So you can imagine how shaken I'm these days, no? When we have a labor reform and a new law of universities. No? And we also have another keynote, Brendan Barchel, no? Another key issue, which is mental health and working conditions. At the University of Castilla-La Mancha, we are quite aware of mental health. We have increased our psychology service, the service we offer to students and also to the workers of the university, and we will offer a new degree in psychology from 2023. And just to finish, let me give you a few words about the university to, I don't know how to say it in English, to sacar pecho, how we say it, to be proud of. Because the University of Castilla-La Mancha is a general and regional university. We have 4 big campuses. 2 of them are located in World Heritage Cities. I'm sure you already know that Albacete is not one of those, but anyway, it's a nice city. And we have around 26,000 students in undergraduate and graduate students, and we offer 59 degrees and double degrees and 18 PhD programs. And regarding economics and related topics, we have 5 faculties where we offer business administration, and in 3 faculties we offer labor economics and human resources, and in 1 faculty, in this one, we offer the degree of economics. No? And well, regarding research, let me tell you that the University of Castilla-La Mancha is ranked between 301 and 400 in the Shanghai ranking, in the ARWU ranking, academic ranking of all universities by subject, by topics in economics. No? We are in the top 400 of the world, and rank 7th to 9th in Spain. The Times Higher Education ranking ranks in economics the University of Castilla-La Mancha in the top 500 of the world, and CIMAGO ranking ranks the University of Castilla-La Mancha 299 position. No? So I think that for a university located in a region as Castilla-La Mancha, I think it's to be proud of being in these positions. This is because we have, as Maria Angel said, a really good group of people that with more or less money, but with a lot of work and effort, do a lot of things. So I wish you a fruitful meeting, full of work, full of networking, full of research ideas. And just let me tell you that we are celebrating not only the start of this conference, but also we're celebrating a birthday today. 30 years ago, 30th of June in 1982, the University of Castilla-La Mancha was officially created by law. So just to add some different things, I was going to ask you to sing Happy Birthday, but no, I think with the applause it's enough. So I wish you a fruitful meeting. Okay, thank you.
Mejor cerca. Well, now we're going to start with our first keynote speaker. As you know, our first keynote speaker is Seamus McGuinness. He is a research professor and the program coordinator of labour market research at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin. ESRI is the largest research institute in Ireland, and he is the head of the Labour Market Research Unit, which is quite a large unit. He obtained his PhD in Queen's University Belfast in 2003, and then he held research positions in Northern Ireland. From then he moved to Melbourne in Australia and back to Ireland, where he has worked not only in ESRI, but also he is also working in Trinity College Dublin, as well as an associate adjunct professor. In ESRI, he has developed a wide range of topics, research topics, and he has been working on different areas, both on Irish issues and European Union issues, mostly labour market related, but his very strong point is skills and educational mismatches. And all of you who have worked at some point about these issues, education and skill mismatches, you have probably known that it is very difficult to go through one education mismatch paper which has not a quote on McGuinness. It is always the same McGuinness, him. So that would explain more or less his huge H index. But he's generous enough to be here to give a keynote speech not about his topic of expertise, but about the topic of research that we have asked him to do, which is one tiny strand of research of about 3 or 4 papers about minimum wage in employment, because we thought that Spanish audience would be very much interested in this issue, given that we have gone through a reform of that. So we really appreciate and thank him for this generosity, not only coming here, but coming here and presenting a keynote which is not related with his main expertise. This is really, really good. Seamus has worked extensively, not only in research, but also providing advice for different national and international institutions, such as the OECD, CDFOP, the European Commission, and many others. I just wanted to say that he's extraordinarily generous in coming here. I have experienced how welcoming he is as a host, and I wish I could be as a good host for him that he was for me. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for the invite. It is a great honour to I can move it up a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Is that okay? It's as high as I can go without putting it right inside my mouth. So yeah, it's a great honour to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. So the talk I'm going to give today is on minimum wages, employment in Europe, and lessons for Spain. As Maria said, it's not my primary research area, but it is a research area that I have been active with for the last 6 years in the ESRI. We're an independent organisation, but we have a contract. We advise the Low Pay Commission in Ireland, who make recommendations to the Irish government on minimum wages, and we have produced a series of papers, some of which are reports, some of which are published in peer-reviewed journals, and that will form the basis of what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to be going through the real technical and econometrics behind these estimates. It's pretty basic research on minimum wages. You need a couple of things. You need data. You need data on people who are in receipt of the minimum wage, data on people who are not in receipt of the minimum wage, and ideally you need time periods. One time period when no one got the minimum wage, and another period where the minimum wage was switched on. And in Ireland, you could say we're fortunate in some respects that all those conditions are met. So we've been able to do some very interesting sort of topics on the minimum wage. But obviously there are a series of reasons for that the minimum wage is switched off for a period of almost 10 years where no one received it. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So although we benefit as researchers, obviously there are, that is potentially to the detriment of people who would have otherwise been in receipt of the minimum wage. So I'm going to talk slowly because I know my accent, I'm from the north of Ireland, I'm over the border, can be particularly problematic. So in terms of the structure of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about why do we need minimum wages, what are the arguments for minimum wages, what are the risk factors associated with minimum wages, and what is the evidence related to that? Do they harm, do they benefit people, low-wage workers? Do they harm them potentially? Do they harm businesses and productivity? And then I'm going to reflect on some comparative analysis that we did, again, a recent report that we published last year, where we looked at and we compared minimum wages across Europe in terms of what are the rates that the minimum wage is paid, how do they compare across countries, what is the incidence of the minimum wage, because if you set a minimum wage that is so low that it affects only a small proportion of workers, then it's pretty pointless. What is the relationship between minimum wages and poverty and job satisfaction, which is a measure of job quality? And then I'm going to move on to some of the evidence from our individual evaluations where we looked at the impacts of the minimum wage in Ireland and the lessons that we drew from that in terms of what are the negative impacts potentially on workers? Are there negative impacts for particular groups of workers with particularly low levels of wage bargaining, such as those on temporary contracts, part-time workers? If we're just focusing on minimum wage workers when we're doing this literature, are we actually underestimating the impact of minimum wages? Because if you strike a minimum wage, it not only impacts the people who receive it, but it can have further implications for people further up the wage distribution who earn above the minimum wage. And if that's the case, then the impact on things like income inequality or in-work poverty may be greater than initially we think by just looking at minimum wage workers. I'll talk a little bit about the impacts of on labour costs, because I believe there's a debate in Spain that if you increase the labour costs, there's concern if you increase the minimum wage too much, it could harm productivity, it could harm firms, and there could be reductions in employment. We have some evidence on that relating to Ireland, and then I'll sum up. And I'm happy to stop for any points of clarification if that's required. So why do we need minimum wages? Well, minimum wages are becoming an increasingly common component of most developed economies. So most economies and labour markets recognise that there is a need for minimum wages. So based on OECD data, 26 of its 34 members as of 2015 currently implement a statutory minimum wage. So the majority of developed economies in the world implement a statutory minimum wage. And why is it implemented? Well, why do governments adopt it? It's primarily there to ensure that there is a minimum earnings level for low-paid workers who are generally accepted to have low levels of wage bargaining power. So as I said, they tend to be in sectors that are not unionised, such as accommodation and food in many countries, part-time workers, again low wage bargaining power, and people on non-temporary, non-permanent contracts, permanent workers who really have little power in terms of negotiating wage levels. So the minimum wage is there to protect those types of workers, to ensure that there is a minimum income standard that is met. And by propping up the lowest paid in society, we would hope also that the policy would reduce in-work poverty. It would squeeze the income distribution, so therefore levels of general wage inequality should also be lower. So those are the reasons and the policy arguments that economies and labour markets and governments typically use when adopting the minimum wage. However, not everyone is a fan, and particularly within even the academic literature, this is a religious issue for some neoclassical economists who really oppose any sort of regulation in labour markets, and you'll see this argument still being played out in some of the journals, but less so, because most of the arguments have proven not to really hold much water. But there is a concern in terms of when a minimum wage is being struck, usually some sort of social partnership or tripartite negotiations will be involved, and the business side of those discussions or those meetings will generally say, look, minimum wages cannot go too high, because if you do that, then there is a possibility that labour costs will increase to such an extent that international competitiveness will be affected. And minimum wage workers can also be potentially damaged by increases in the minimum wage. So if employers react to an increase in the minimum wage by firing minimum wage workers in order to reduce the wage bill, that's called an extensive margin effect. So they can be affected at the extensive margin, where they lose their jobs entirely as a result of a minimum wage increase, or at the intensive margin. And this is where really they keep their jobs, but the employer reduces the number of hours that they are employed for. So they keep their jobs at the higher rate, but their income is reduced because their hours are reduced. So what does the evidence tell us? Very briefly, in terms of what the literature says. In terms of employment loss, this impact on minimum wage workers at the extensive margin, we would summarise the international literature as saying, yes, there are some studies, a minority of studies, a small minority of studies that have detected some job loss effects. But the vast majority of the literature finds no effect, with no relationship between the minimum, increasing the minimum wage and job loss. That is simply a fact. With respect to impacts at the intensive margin, there is much more balance in terms of the evidence and the literature. So this is the extent we ask the question, when looking at the literature, we're looking at the evidence, do employers react to an increase in the minimum wage by reducing the hours worked of low-paid workers? There is more evidence on that. Some studies find no effects, other studies find some effects, but particularly effects within particular groups of workers, what we call heterogeneous impacts. So, and I will show you that we did find some of those impacts for Irish minimum wage changes. So the evidence, job loss, no, it's not a valid argument. There's no evidence to support that. But there is an argument that you need to be careful that workers aren't being affected by reductions in hours worked, by reductions in overtime, and that those reductions aren't focused particularly within particular groups of very vulnerable, low-paid workers. So I'm now going to look at, well, how does minimum wages compare across Europe? So this is a study that we published last year. We used EU Silk data, and we just said, well, we wanted to advise the Irish Low Pay Commission, where do our Irish minimum wages sit relative to other countries? How does it relate to things such as poverty, wage inequality, job satisfaction compared to other countries? Do our minimum wage workers look different compared to other countries? Because that also is important for policymakers. So this is some of the results from that study. And again, I'm going to highlight both Ireland and Spain in that respect. So the first thing we looked at was how many people are actually in receipt of the minimum wage. What proportion of the workforce are in the receipt of the minimum wage? So obviously, as I said, if your minimum wage isn't capturing the lower segment of your wage distribution to a certain extent, if it's only hitting 1 or 2% of people, it's pretty pointless, as is the case in Belgium. So you can see in Belgium, the minimum wage, only 1.7% of workers are affected by the minimum wage. This is based on our own calculations using EU Silk data, and you can look at the report, but we adjust because we're having to combine hours and earnings, and we allow for a margin of adjustment, but our estimates match exactly with Eurostat's. So you can see that, yeah, it's pretty pointless in countries like really Belgium, the Netherlands. No one's really affected. It's not really having much of an impact. In Ireland, we're sort of doing a little bit better. Around 10% of employees are impacted by the minimum wage changes, and that doesn't change much as in terms of each minimum wage round. I'm just trying to use this pointer because I'm usually terrible at these things. But you can see Spain is at the upper end of the distribution. So I think this is using data from 2018 that was published in 2020, Silk data. We estimate that around 14% of employees in employment in Spain are impacted by the minimum wage. So it's pretty high, and the highest up there is Portugal. So in terms of having minimum wages that are effective to a level that they impact people's lives and workers' lives, Spain is doing relatively well, I would say. Ireland, less so. In terms of how much is the minimum wage, is it really high? I mean, this is a concern for a lot of policymakers. So the blue line is just the nominal minimum wage, and the red, or the pink or the orange, I'm a bit colourblind, that's PPP adjusted, so different. So that's fully comparable across countries. So you can see Ireland, we're doing great in terms of the nominal minimum wage. We're second highest in this group of countries. So this group of countries, we take Ireland, 12 European countries plus the UK for the Silk data. We couldn't fit everyone into the tables. But you see then, after we adjust for differences in prices, Ireland falls to about 6th. And Spain is pretty high in terms of purchasing power parity. There isn't much difference between the nominal and the PPP adjusted ranking. So the minimum wage in Spain is probably around the 6th or 7th highest within this group of countries after we account for differences in prices. Okay, so it looks, to summarise, Ireland is high, not affecting an awful lot of people. Spain is relatively high minimum wage country with a relatively high coverage rate in terms of the number of people that are being affected. Now, when I first started doing my first minimum wage paper, I wrote when I was in the University of Melbourne. We were advising the Australian Low Pay Commission, and I was as shocked as anyone to discover that most minimum wage workers aren't poor, that the majority of minimum wage workers are actually from high-income households. And in Australia, the situation when we looked at it was the majority of them were either second earners in high-income households who were working part-time, or students who were obviously studying. And this is a phenomenon that has been repeated, particularly for the Irish case, but the situation does vary considerably. Generally, we are concerned that minimum wages and poverty aren't well correlated, but there are differences at a cross-country level. So here we're looking at the proportion of minimum wage workers who are in households who are at risk of poverty. So they belong to a household where the equivalized household income is below 60% of the average. So you can see that in Ireland, we are really not doing well. 11% of our minimum wage workers are in households at risk of poverty. To put it another way, over 90% of our minimum wage workers are not in households at risk of poverty. You can see in the Netherlands and Luxembourg, it's pretty high. So almost half of the minimum wage workers there are actually in households that have a relatively high poverty risk. And in Spain, it's a pretty good coverage in terms of 1/3 of Spanish minimum wage workers are in households that are at risk of poverty. The problem with this type of statistic is it's just a crosstab. These minimum wage workers, lots of them are also in accommodation and food, lots of them are also part-time workers, lots of them are also in temporary contracts, and all of those factors also increase your risk of poverty. So in the next slide, we run a simple probit model for poverty risk in every country, and we control for all these other variables, and we take the coefficient from the minimum wage and we say, well, controlling for other factors, what is the extent to which minimum wage workers in each country have a higher probability of being in a poor household compared to non-minimum wage workers? So this is the results from the Probit model. It's pretty sad. Ireland's coming out worse again here. So in Ireland, controlling for other factors, a minimum wage employee is only 7 percentage points more likely to be in a poor or at risk of poverty household compared to a non-minimum wage worker. Again, Spain is doing quite well. The marginal effect in the Spanish model is 17 percentage points. And it's close to the highest sort of element of Estonia, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. So again, pretty good. It's not perfect. As I said, it's still the case that the majority of people on the minimum wage in Spain will not be in poor households or in households at risk of poverty. But in terms of the impacts, it seems to be a lot better. And I will also caveat here a point that I'm going to make later. There's a big risk when policymakers go away and say, well, this is all the story. We're only hitting 70, there's only this marginal effect of 17 percentage points on in-work poverty. But if it is the case that by increasing this minimum wage, other people further up the distribution, just a little bit up, in the next 5% to 10%, the next 15%, are also being pushed upwards in terms of their wages, then the impacts in poverty will go beyond the minimum wage. So if there are wider distributional impacts that go beyond the minimum wage workers themselves to other parts of the distribution, the impact of poverty on in-work poverty will be greater than what we're seeing here. So it's just to bear that in mind. And I will come back to that in a little minute. So another issue that we look at is, well, there is this perception that minimum wage jobs are really poor quality jobs, and that minimum wage workers are pretty unhappy. They tend to have worse working conditions. Their jobs tend to be more precarious, and we would expect job satisfaction levels to be much lower in minimum wage jobs. So what we do here is, again, we use the SILK data, and we estimate a job satisfaction model for each labour market. We control for other factors, and we say, well, what in these models, what is the relationship between being on the minimum wage and having low job satisfaction? And we use this sort of, the model goes from 0 to 10 in terms of job satisfaction in SILK. So this is 6 to 10 is being satisfied. So we've squeezed that sort of continuous variable into a binary. So what we're saying, actually, the interesting bit is in these countries here, there is no, in the Netherlands, Spain, UK, Germany and France, minimum wage workers are no more likely to be dissatisfied in their jobs than non-minimum wage workers. We find no negative effect. And actually, when we do find an effect, it's relatively small for some countries. In other countries, again, Ireland's coming out bad again. Job satisfaction levels, our dissatisfaction is probably at the upper end of the spectrum of minimum wage workers. But I would say if we take this sort of cut-off point as being neutral to okay, from our sample, 50% of the country's job satisfaction amongst minimum wage workers was not much lower or the same as that for non-minimum wage workers. So before going on to our evaluation of results, it's probably worth thinking about how are minimum wages decided in the first place. And the approaches to minimum wage decision making vary a good bit between countries. And there are different approaches, as we'll see. So in Ireland, for example, we have a low pay commission. So this is an expert group that was established in 2015. We have social partners in there, the trade unions are there, employers are there, economists are there, and they then make a recommendation to the Irish government on the level of the minimum wage. And they are also supported by ourselves in the ESRI, where we have an ongoing programme of research where all these papers have been produced that helps inform the low pay commission what rate to strike. This sort of, other countries take a similar approach to Ireland using expert committees or wage groups. Like the UK has a low pay commission, so has France, Germany and Greece. There are several countries that use a formula to determine the minimum wage. So in the Netherlands and Luxembourg, the minimum wage is adjusted based on changes in average wages. Belgium uses a pre-agreed formula where minimum wages are based on changes to the cost of living. In Estonia, they also have a rule that it's a methodology that's been agreed between the social partners and the governments in 2017. And based on productivity and economic growth, the minimum wage will be struck with a stipulation that it must be at least 40% of the average wage. Other countries have a social partnership agreement or approach. In Portugal, for example, the government decides what the minimum wage will be and then they consult the social partners. That was the case in Spain, is my understanding, until 2020. We're now, instead of deciding what the minimum wage would be and then consultation, the approach has moved to a consultation between the government and the social partners prior to a proposal being formed. And Hungary and Latvia also have tripartite social partnership agreements. This type of approach doesn't always work, it generally does. For example, in Poland in 2019, the talks between the government and the social partners broke down. And ironically, the government then introduced a minimum wage that was higher than the rate that the trade unions were actually looking for. So the wage setting characteristics our approaches are important. We don't know exactly what role they have in terms of the impacts of the minimum wage, but what I would say is if you have a tripartite approach or an expert committee approach, you tend to get a more balanced view on the relative impacts of a minimum wage, and it is less likely, I think, that you will see it having adverse effects on workers or firms. Finally, going back to our work on minimum wages at an EU level, it's quite amazing. I've looked at this in Australia, we looked at it in Ireland, we looked at it across a range of EU countries. There's a very strong set of characteristics that define minimum wage workers, and they don't change very much across countries. So minimum wage workers tend to be younger, they tend to have lower levels of education, they're more likely to work part-time, they are more likely to be non-nationals, and they're more likely to be women. There are some differences that occur from country to country. For example, in Ireland, we have the highest concentration in accommodation, food and wholesale, again, down to our reliance on tourism, I guess. As you've seen, our minimum wage workers aren't particularly at a high risk of poverty compared to other countries. And there is no skewness towards females. Males and females are equally likely to be minimum wage workers in Ireland. I looked at the Spanish data, and what I found the standout aspect of the Spanish minimum wage employment model was that non-nationals are more likely to be minimum wage workers in Spain compared to other EU countries that I've been looking at here. So given that I'm going to now move on to talking about minimum wages in Ireland and a lot of the evidence, I'll talk a little bit about the history of the minimum wages in Ireland, not laboriously so. Basically, our Low Pay Commission was set up in 2015. And the first increases became in 2016-17, so the minimum wages increased every year from the Low Pay Commission has been set up. The Low Pay Commission is chaired by an independent chair who is appointed by the government. So how independent is that? But generally speaking, my experience of them, they have been fair. There are representatives from business on one side of the table, employers, trade unions, and there are also independent experts. Now, an interesting thing is that although we have had this Low Pay Commission from 2015, there has been a minimum wage act in Ireland since 2000, when the rate was struck at €5.58. I don't know why that's up in sterling. I don't know. It must have been presented to someone in the north. However, the economic crisis stuck, and had us had minimum wage increases stopped at 2007. Interestingly enough, Ireland, as you know, we had a banking crisis. We had a massive collapse in our economy, and we were bailed out. So we had the Troika, which is the ECB, the IMF, who's the other? There's the European Commission. So basically they were running the show for 2 years in Ireland. And one of the first things that they did was insist that the minimum wage was cut. So we had a temporary reduction of the minimum wage was reduced at the behest of the Troika from 8 to 7.65 to 7.65 which is a big reduction. In 2011, there was a huge amount of uproar in the country because of this, and it was quickly restored. People hit the streets, people weren't happy. But what this just shows you is in terms of these institutions, like the ECB, the IMF, or the Commission, you know, there is a there must be some sort of underlying philosophy there that minimum wages are bad, and, you know, the way to get, and it's the people at the bottom are getting paid too much, and that's what's stopping economic growth. But it goes back to the point that I make, that for some people and for some economists, this is a matter of religion rather than a matter of practical economic policy. And that's the history of the minimum wages in Ireland. So we were increasing gradually until 2007. We stopped. The Troika took us down. Then we went back up. And then we stayed sort of there until our minimum wage increases kicked in again after the Low Pay Commission was established. And this is the advantage that I'm talking about, although it is an advantage to us as researchers, because you can see that this break between 2016 and 2011 gives us a period of zero minimum wage activity in Ireland, against which we can benchmark and measure the impacts of minimum wages in a control and treatment group using a difference in difference scenario. So we can look at the minimum wage workers and the non-minimum wage workers in 2015. You know, what were their hours worked? What was their employment rate before this was switched on? We can then look at it in 2016 and we can measure the difference in the difference. And this is the methodology that runs through our research papers, because we have this sort of inbuilt advantage in the data. Well, for us, again, I stress. So in terms of how you measure these things, it's pretty basic, actually. It's just a difference in difference methodology. It's just a linear regression. So say we have hours worked, we have this is a two-period one. We have the year in which this is 2016, the year in which the minimum wage was introduced. This is our treatment group, the minimum wage workers, and the impact of the minimum wage is just the interaction effect on beta 4 between the time dummy and the treatment dummy. Very, very basic, but difference and difference equations, as you know, are very powerful. Even though it's a very simplistic framework, the time invariant fixed effect falls out, so it does control for things like time invariant unobserved heterogeneity. Now, and obviously, one of the things you need to check for when you're estimating these models is parallel trends, or parallel dynamics, that before the minimum wage change, after the minimum wage change, if we see divergence, that's an indicator of a treatment effect, but there should be no divergence in the period before the minimum wage, because if we see the pre-trend was going like that and the post-trend was going like that, then obviously that's not a treatment effect, that's just a continuation of a diverging trend. So we have to check that there are parallel trends beforehand. We also need to do things by, when we're looking at minimum wage workers, who do we compare them against? Do we compare them against everybody else in the wage distribution? No, what our approach has been, let's look at the minimum wage workers and compare them to workers who are earning just above the minimum wage. So we can be sure that in doing so, it's more of a like-for-like comparison. Some people estimate difference in difference models with propensity score matching, which essentially does the same thing. So our first paper, looking at the impact, this 2016 impact of the minimum wage in Ireland, we published in Fiscal Studies. And actually, we had minimum wage changes, but we had no data. Our labour force survey had no wage data. So in this paper, we had to use wage decile information combined with hours to try and guess who the minimum wage workers were. But when we did that, what we found was that overall, there was no impact of employment loss, right? Following this minimum wage change, we found no evidence that jobs were lost. We did find this very small reduction in hours worked of 0.16 hours amongst minimum wage workers that was statistically significant in 2016. But what we found was the major finding of that study was following the 2016 implementation increase in the minimum wage, the hours worked of those on temporary contracts fell by 2.7 hours per week. So these are people with very low levels of wage bargaining. So that was a concern. And it also sort of built into our minds that when we are going forward in this research, you need to look for heterogeneous effects. You cannot just estimate an impact for all minimum wage workers and say, well, that's grand, there's nothing happening here. You need to look below the surface and particularly for what we call career minimum wage workers. There's lots of people on the minimum wage for which this doesn't really matter. You know, they're students, they're going to move on in a few years. They're second earners in high-income households. But there are a group who are predominantly male, have longer tenure, have family responsibilities, who do rely on the minimum wage as their sole income, who are heavily dependent upon it. So we term these career minimum wage workers. In Ireland, they tend to be more in the manufacturing sector. So, number one, we need to look out for these heterogeneous impacts among particular groups of workers. And secondly, we need to be sure that there is definitely no adverse effects being felt by workers who are career minimum wage workers. So this is what we do in our next paper, and this is only published a few years ago, no, a few months ago. So now we say, well, look, we see what the 2016 effect is. Let's see what the 2017 effect is and the 2018 effect. Because minimum wage impacts can evolve over time, as I'll show you. And also, the impacts on particular groups of workers can change over time. So our evidence is that there are some limited impacts in terms of this intensive margin where workers' hours are being cut as a result of the minimum wage, but it is localized within particular groups. So here you can see, for this model, we estimate a fully flexible diff and diff, Morrow and Regio. This is great in the sense that it subtracts out differences in pre-treatment dynamics. But this paper has not, has this paper been published? No, it's not in the journal form yet. But it's out as a report. So you can see here, here's the treatment period, 2015, okay? You can see in 2016, and everything, the diff and the diff relates to the 2015 point also. But you can see really that for all minimum wage workers, there wasn't any impact in 2016. It was starting to get a little bit negative in 2017. But by 2018, you can look at that as a cumulative impact. We were finding that across all minimum wage workers, they had lost an hour per week as a result of the minimum wage, looking back to the 2015 pre-treatment period. And that result differed. We got different results, and it was being driven in different ways depending on the type of worker that we were looking at. So here's the guys in temporary contracts. So here we're using a different data set, but we get the same result that we got in our fiscal studies paper, this 2.5 hours drop in 2016. And you can see what was happening in 2016. There was a slight decline following the minimum wage and the hours worked of the people on minimum wages, but there was a much bigger increase in the hours worked among people who were earning above the minimum wage. We found then in 2017 this sort of trended downwards together, but by 2018, actually the negative effect that we observed in 2016 for temporary workers had dissipated, it had gone. So in that case, things had sort of evened out following the minimum wage changes, and by 2018, temporary workers were no longer being negatively affected. Different case for the non-nationals. So in terms of the non-nationals, following the minimum wage, both the hours worked of both minimum and non-minimum non-nationals increased, but you can see they started to diverge in 2017, and by 2018, minimum wage workers who were non-nationals were being employed for 2.5 hours a week less than minimum wage workers who were Irish nationals. Very worrying. Again, we find different defaults. I'll move it through. This is the bit that worries us a lot. These are the guys that are career minimum wage workers, the minimum wage workers in manufacturing who I said have longer tenure, are more likely to have family responsibilities. By 2018, we saw these cumulative effects. It jumps about a bit, but by 2018, those guys had lost about 3 hours per week following the minimum wage compared to non-minimum wage workers in terms of our diff and diff estimate. So that is obviously hugely worrying. And then accommodation and food, that was okay for the first couple of years, but we see a negative effect kicking in for guys in that sector. Again, a group of workers with particularly low levels of bargaining power. And finally, we do some interaction effects. I think this is more significant than it looks, but we were hitting sample size difficulties here. This is the impact amongst non-nationals in accommodation and food. So, as I said, there is this issue of heterogeneous effects. Don't look at the overall top-line estimate and say everything's okay. You need to look below the surface and see what are the groups, are there differences in the groups that are being affected? Who are they? What is their poverty risk, etc. And that's really what you need to be telling policymakers in this area. So you can see that there was a reduction in terms of, in Ireland, non-nationals, these career workers in manufacturing, accommodation and food, and particularly Irish non-nationals in accommodation and food in Ireland. In terms of, we didn't see any effect in these other components of the economy. Now, it is worth noting that as these groups of workers' wages are falling, their minimum wage levels are also increasing. So it is possible that you lose a number of hours worked, but your take-home or nominal pay remains constant because you're being compensated by a higher minimum wage. So this is the, you can see how, first of all, how we get heterogeneous effects and how they vary over time. But when we see, for the groups that were adversely affected, what we do here is we say, well, actually what's happened to their nominal wages? And even though they suffered hours lost, these groups, as a result of the minimum wage increase, their nominal wages increased. However, I would say for the guys in accommodation and food, even though we had, and industry, these are nominal. Probably when you strip out inflation, in terms of real wages, I would expect, even though we had low inflation during that period, their incomes would have dropped. So these are the types of things that we take to the Local Pay Commission. I'll move on. I don't know how I'm doing for time, Maria. Okay, no bother. So we do have these concerns, but we've spoken about poverty before. I've shown you that minimum wages are very poorly correlated with poverty. But I'm only looking at the poverty or the impacts of the minimum wage on the people on minimum wages and how they are and how that's related to poverty. But what if it's the case that in Ireland, for example, the minimum wage hits the bottom 10% of workers? But what, as a result of that minimum wage, non-minimum wage workers look behind them and say, well, we want to maintain our relativities, and they go into a wage bargaining process that also increases the wage levels of the next 10% of the workforce. In that case, then, the minimum wage arguably has an impact on the 10% who are directly affected by the minimum wage and have their earnings lifted. And then the next 10% in the wage distribution who, as a result of the minimum wage, have bargained their wages upwards also. So the impact on in-work poverty goes from the bottom 10% of the wage distribution to potentially the bottom 20% or the bottom 30%. But these different methodologies don't allow us to see that. So what we do here, and this is a paper that we published in Oxford Economic Papers last year, is we say, well, actually, let's look at the impact of minimum wages on the total distribution, the cumulative distribution function of wages, and see actually who exactly gets shifted out following a minimum wage increase. And this is quite sort of simple stuff. So what we do here is we use silk data. We estimate a distributional regression approach, which is, it's theoretically equivalent to quantile regression. Well, you can see it, but I can't. That's right. So it's theoretically equivalent to a quantile regression approach, although a lot of research says it fits wage distributions better. And what we do here is very simple. We have a wage distribution in 2015, and we have a wage distribution in 2016. We estimate regressions for different sections of the 2015 wage distribution based on the characteristics of people that were in the employment in 2015. And then we average those coefficients over the actual characteristics of people in the labour market in 2016. And then that gives us a counterfactual, because it tells us, here is the 2016 wage distribution, And here's the 2016 wage distribution, given the wage relationships that existed in 2015 before the minimum wage was struck. And by comparing those distributions, we can look at the impact, the overall impact of the minimum wage on the earnings distribution. I'll show you graphically in a little minute. And it's sort of like an Oaxaca decomposition. We can then back out the parts of the wage, that change that is due to a pure price effect, a pure minimum wage effect. But remember, some of the characteristics and makeup of the labour market will have changed between 2015 and 2016. So some of the wage changes will be due to changes in the composition of workers over that period. So we can back out the price and composition effects separately in a very, very simple way, very similar to what we do in a Oaxaca decomposition. So when we do that, what we find is that if we look at the distribution of earnings here, without the minimum wage in 2016, if we look at this counterfactual distribution, we would expect that around 10% of workers would have been earning below the 915 level, which is the 2016 minimum wage. But when we look at the actual distribution, okay, we find that only 6% of workers actually earn below that level. So we can see that as a result of the minimum wage, the proportion of workers earning below the minimum wage fell from 10 to 6%. Or there was a reduction of 4 percentage points in that segment of the distribution. But what we also found was very significant spillover effects in the distributional impact. So we found that actually there were significant shifts in the distribution up to around 12.15 an hour, so that the minimum wage change that affected just 10% of workers in Ireland in 2016 actually had some sort of significant wage impacts for the bottom 30% of the income distribution. So here you can see it. Okay, so the 2016 line here is the actual CDF of wages for 2016. This is our counterfactual. This is what we estimate using the coefficients from the 2015 model. And you can see that all the action is around that minimum wage increase point, that red line of 915. That's where the minimum wage was struck. You can see that all of the action is there. So you can see that there's a significant reduction in the proportions, 4 percentage points when you fill in that tail and add it up, of people earning below that 916. That's much lower in the actual 2016 distribution compared to what we would affect. But you can also see that there are impacts beyond the minimum wage range. Yeah? And this is where we back out the composition and the price effect. So you can see that the total difference at the minimum wage range is all a price effect. It's all the minimum wage. And here we're saying, well, the proportion of as a result of minimum wage workers, the proportion earning below this is 4 percentage points below what we would expect before if the minimum wage had not existed. But you can see that there are also proportions earning higher levels of wages that have also fallen 2 percentage points at this level here as a result of that minimum wage. So that's the incremental shift up the distribution. You can see that this is the composition effect, so that as we go up, we subtract the composition effect from the total effect to get the price effect. So there's a zero price effect there further on. And this is where we put standard errors around that price effect. Okay, so what we're saying is there are significant reductions in the proportion of people, 4 percentage points here at the minimum wage rate, and that's statistically significant. But this statistical significant effect in terms of shifting people from lower to higher parts of the wage distribution goes up to 1260, which affects the bottom 30% of earnings. And we can look at, if we look at just these ratios, which are measures of general wage inequality in the Irish labour market, you can see that both using the ratio of the 90th to the 10th wage percentiles, or the 75th to the 25th, you can see that there's been a drop there in terms of general wage inequality following this one minimum wage increment. And here we can do it in terms of what would inequality be like in the counterfactual distribution, the counterfactual CDF, compared to the actual. And what we found that there was about an 8% reduction in wage inequality using the counterfactual distributions as opposed to the actual, as a result of one increase in the minimum wage. So this is the point that I'm stressing, is that by focusing just on the poverty and in-work poverty impacts of minimum wage workers only, we're missing most of the story. Other points to make, other studies that we've published or not, but the work that we've done, we looked at the question of labour market transitions. So a lot of people will argue minimum wages are important because they allow low-skilled workers a footstep onto the labour market that will ultimately allow them to progress to higher and better earnings. Excuse me. We did find some evidence of that. We found that minimum wage workers were likely to move on to higher wage employment after a period, but we also found that they were more likely to move into inactivity or unemployment compared to non-minimum wage workers, which relates to, I suppose, the precarious nature of minimum wage work. The Irish data, we pushed the CSO. There's so much noise when you're trying to estimate minimum wages, when you're trying to take together monthly earnings, monthly hours worked, and then you're trying to convert them to an hourly pay rate, and then you're trying to measure the minimum wage. It's very noisy. So when if I estimated minimum wage non-compliance using silk data, I'd probably get something in the region of 15 to 20%. It would tell, the wage data would tell me there's 15% of people earning below the minimum wage that shouldn't be. So we pushed the CSO to get a data, just a question in the labour force survey. Do you earn the minimum wage? Yes or no? Do you earn less than the minimum wage? What are the reasons for that? Is it sub-minima rate? Is it a trainee rate or whatever? So using that variable, we found that actually non-compliance, minimum wage compliant, minimum wages in Ireland is actually very low. Only around 5% of workers, we feel, that should be on the minimum wage who are not. And that's much lower than you get if you're using these combinations of hours and earnings. Now, the final point that I'll make before summing up is, what's the impact on labour costs? Again, so there is this sort of fear that increasing minimum wages can be very damaging to firms. Again, we have a database in Ireland that's a firm level database. It tells us about average labour costs in terms of hourly or weekly pay, but it also tells us the proportion of workers who are employed within the firm who are on the minimum wage. So again, we were able to estimate different diff models, 2015 to 2016, the treatment group being employers who had minimum wage workers relative to employers who had not minimum wage workers. And what we found was that for the vast majority of firms, following a minimum wage increase, there was no increase in overall labour costs. So that tells us there's very little incentive there for employers to adjust anything as a result of that minimum wage change. For most employers, there are no impacts. But there were impacts detected in highly intensive minimum wage firms. So when we looked at firms where over 50% of employees were in minimum wages, not surprisingly, we found that following the minimum wage change, the diff estimate told us that labour costs increased by 3 to 4 percentage points. But it's important to point out that those high minimum wage intensive firms only account for around 3% of all firms. So it's a very, very small number of firms. But it can be problematic if you have organisations that are employing mostly minimum wage workers, obviously. We did find that, again, we found a 3 to 5% reduction in the probability that minimum wage intensive firms paid any overtime to part-time workers. And that high-intensity minimum wage firms also reduced overtime of full-time employees by 13%. So the high-intensive firms did experience labour costs increases, and they reacted to that by cutting the overtime of both part-time employees and all employees. So we saw that behaviour quite clearly in the results. So just to sum up then, you'll be glad we're there now. Minimum wages, why do we have them? They're typically accepted as providing a floor for low-paid workers. And as I said, they are a common feature of labour markets, particularly those workers who have low bargaining power. In terms of the evidence, as I said, there is very little evidence that that low-paid workers lose their jobs as a result of minimum wages. What I've shown you today is that there are more impacts on the intensive margin,
particularly upon particular groups of workers who find that their hours will be reduced following a minimum wage change. And in some cases, those can be particularly damaging, as I said, particularly for minimum wage workers who are career minimum wage workers. It's often said that the minimum wage is a blunt tool in terms of combating in-work poverty. But as you've seen, the extent of this varies from country to country. It's probably true in terms of Ireland. It's much less true in terms of Spain. But what I've also shown you is by just focusing on the poverty rates of minimum wage workers and ignoring these larger distributional spillover effects, we'll underestimate the impact of minimum wages on poverty. We need to keep an eye on how things change over time. It is not sufficient to do one minimum wage evaluation and say, that's it, lads, all good, and walk away. Things evolve, either at the aggregate level or at the individual worker group level, so you need to keep a check on that. It is also, this is, I think, an important point that is made, is that, look, in terms of combating poverty, the minimum wages should not be your major tool. Most people who are in poverty aren't in employment. They tend to be unemployed, disabled children, or pensioners, etc. And while it is sufficient to have, and important that you have a minimum wage as an anti-poverty tool for people in work poverty, it is not sufficient to turn around and everybody and use it as your only policy tool. Now, I don't know what the situation is in Spain, but I look at UK politicians and British politicians all the time saying the number of people working and going to food banks, etc. And the only thing that they always say is, well, we have the living wage, or we increase the living wage. That's irrelevant, because most people who are subject to poverty aren't in work. So if that's your only policy tool, it's a complete and abject failure of responsibility. And finally, I'd say, there are different mechanisms in terms of how the minimum wage is set, and they vary across countries. It's difficult to see exactly what how important the minimum wage setting mechanism is for the impacts, but I think it's fair to say that the more consultative and the more inclusive the process, the more likely it is to be acceptable, and the less likely it is probably to have negative outcomes either for workers or firms. Thank you. It's too hot.
Hello. Thanks for the conference. It's very, very interesting. One question. What's the evidence on spillover effects in different countries? And if you think that the degree of the impact of the spillover effects can be different depending on the system of wage bargaining in each country.
So in terms of different countries, different effects for different countries. So no, this paper was only for Ireland. I would expect, given given that the Irish percentage of minimum wage workers is quite low, and we had quite big spillover effects. Now in Spain, your coverage is higher, so it's not clear that if you have countries that have bigger coverage levels, will you get lower spillover effects and vice versa. And we're not even sure about what's happening here. We expect that workers are saying, look at these, I want to maintain my relativities. You give the lowest paid, 20 cents an hour. I want 20 cents an hour to keep my relativity to those. So, yeah, I mean, it's an easy thing to do, but we just did it for Ireland in this paper. This wasn't a comparative study. And if I had to guess, I would imagine that the higher the incidence, the lower the spillover effect would be, if I had to guess. So the spillover effects mightn't be that high, as high in Spain, but as I said, you have a higher coverage rate in the first place, in that your relationship between the minimum wage and poverty risk is much higher in Spain
than in other countries, and you're covering more people. But I don't know, that's a guess. And I should say, we also looked at household income. There was no spillover effects in terms of household income or household inequality in terms of the minimum wage. It only affects the wage distribution, not the household distribution. But again, a great question, but I don't have the answer. It's only an Irish-specific study.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. This is Rafiq from Bangladesh. And I have just a question. As per the definition of minimum wage, you have said that the wage who get the lowest because they have lower bargaining power. But this is so far true to our area because there is no unions there. But as far as I know, the European Union or in Europe, there are unions who preserves the right of the low-paid workers. So how the definition is, okay, I don't understand. And another thing is, so far I have understood, I'm sorry, the minimum wage is actually negative in employment in terms of everything. So why still minimum wage is in use? And what difference do you find between the European Union countries and the other countries like Bangladesh where there is no minimum wage rule at all?
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Great. I suppose when I'm talking about bargaining power can take a couple of forms. It's not always about trade unions because trade union density is falling everywhere. So it can be in terms of social partnership arrangements as well, but bargaining power can take place through a trade union. It can take place at the localized level or at the individual level. Bargaining power at a collective bargaining is falling everywhere, but in terms of the people who are either part-time workers, temporary workers, or in particular sectors with more precarious work, they don't even have the collective bargaining at an organisational level. So when I talk about bargaining power, I don't only mean trade unions. It means that these are people who are more likely to be bargaining at an individual level rather than having some collective framework through a house agreement or through a trade union agreement to determine. So that's I suppose what I mean. It's not about trade unions. Why there are negative effects? Yes. Why is there still minimum wages? Well, it's about a balance here. I mean, so in terms of the people who experience negative effects, particularly those in manufacturing, the negative effects are not such as I showed you. Their nominal wages still increase. There might be a slight reduction in their real wages, but they only account for 90% of minimum wage employees. So for the vast majority, for most of the time, the effects are positive. But this is the case in the sense that there needs to be a balancing act. And this is the type of evidence that you need to bring towards a low-pay commission and say, well, actually, for maybe we need different mechanisms for different sectors of the economy that, you know, it's not sufficient that we just use minimum wages as a blanket policy when actually it's affecting some of our lowest paid workers. So you can look at other things around tax breaks that are at particular sectors or whatever, or closing off contractual or temporary employment, or providing temporary employees with greater rights. So there are different ways in which you can do it. But it is the case that it is a balancing act. And that's a matter for policymakers at the end of the day. You know, we show them the evidence. They see that there's some negative effects. They see that there's some positive effects. They see that there's some positive effects beyond the minimum wage group. But I think that as long as the negative effects are relatively small relative to the greater good, then minimum wages will continue to exist and they will continue to increase. I think for developing economies, it's very different because of informality is a big issue within developing labour markets. So, and some of the work that I've done in the ILO and the Asian Development Bank, it's just a different scenario for those labour markets. It's not a generally accepted phenomenon within developed developing and economies and middle-income economies that minimum wages are a good thing. These are OECD countries, some of the wealthiest economies in the world. Those economies have developed to such an extent that they're saying, yeah, we have these high income levels. We also have these high levels of, and for us, and for that group of countries, minimum wages are an appropriate and an important mechanism to have within the labour market setup.
Thanks for the nice presentation. Mine is a very quick question. It's related to the previous one. It's about Northern Ireland. Like, how is it working? Is there any kind of convergence, spillover effect, or it's just curiosity? So how is it working?
So look, I mean, first of all, myself and Duncan McVicker from Queen's University have a paper. We use the Northern Ireland border as a control group, and we look at cross-border effects. We don't find much of an impact there anyway. But for the wider perspective, Brexit has changed everything in terms of the Irish north-south dimension. So obviously the impact of constitutional change so it's not so much there is no border in the Isle of Ireland yet. And what we have is we have a common travel area. We have a single market for workers. If there are any regulatory barriers there, then that's going to cause a big problem. I live in the north. I work in the south. We estimate that there's 30,000 people work in the north going to the south every day. But at a wider level, people are aghast, to be honest, at this British government's behaviour in terms of breaking international law, Brexit, everything else. So what we have seen is an increase in work looking at the issue of constitutional change in Ireland. That's really ramped up. There's north-south analysis. I've published a paper on the Northern Ireland border poll, the Cambridge Journal of Economics. So yeah, it hasn't affected the minimum wage dimension. It has the impact of affecting cross-border flows. And even at the moment, there is a big problem in the sense that people going from the north to the south because of flexible working are now under different regulations because of Brexit and other factors, and they're being treated differently now by the Irish tax authorities to their disadvantage. So it's a can of worms. It's a great question. We just have to see how it goes. If the protocol worked well, so no issues in terms of labour flows. If something else is brought in as a result of these breaks, then we don't know where it will go. But I wish I knew the answer to that one. Yeah.
Is there someone else?